Here, the Brooklyn artists Nucleus, with their 1984 track, Jam On It, used a higher-pitched, fluttering type of 303 sound to accompany the lower non-303 bassline hook.
Jam on it. I said jam on it. I said jam on is the funky beat that takes control with the short sharp boogie that'll rock your soul. Jam on it. Jam on it. I said jam on it. Get out of your seat and jam to the beat and don't you dare stop the early morning. Jam on it. Jam on it. Jam on it.
Around the same time period, as TB-303 units went for cheap through second-hand channels due to their scant popularity and success in most mainstream music, other musicians experimenting with new sounds began using them. After breakdance music had peaked in the US, club culture continued use of the 303. Chicago musicians Earl Smith and Nathaniel Jones, who recorded under the moniker Future, took to tweaking more than just the pitch knob on the box. By manipulating all 6 knobs on the front of the 303, they drove it farther away from traditional bassline sounds and into a squelching, alien territory. This sound ultimately grew into what is known today as acid house. The acid house sound would soon travel across the ocean to the UK, where grassroots ecstasy and rave culture was exploding, culminating in 1988's so-called Summer of Love parties throughout the kingdom's warehouses and countrysides. Here are the UK's 808 State, with their acid track, Flow Coma, released in 1988. Notice the multi-layering of 303 patterns. Other artists who rose to prominence during the UK's rave movement would lift the music's trademark 303 sound out of the underground and into the pop charts. Here are the merry pranksters Jim Cauty and Bill Drummond, aka the KLF, with their house crossover anthem, What Time Is Love, which reached into the top 5 of the UK pop charts around its release in 1990.
What time is love? What time is love? What time is love? What time is love?
Slowly but surely, these new, so-called basslines, created by 303 knob twiddling, emerged to become staple ingredients in both pop and alternative/experimental music, equally in the US and abroad. By the early 1990s, electronic music was well underway in its multiplying and hybridizing of forms, producing vast numbers of new music genres and subgenres. The pace of experimentation, especially aided by cheap little boxes like the 303, was matched only by a rigor to sort the sonic experiments into digestible categories. Minimal techno, loungy abstract jazz and hip-hop, intelligent dance music, or IDM for short, and Detroit electro bass, to name just a few. At times, all used the TB-303 sound as a fundamental bassline ingredient. Noticing an increase in the incorporation of the 303 sound in popular music of all types, Roland, in order perhaps to exploit the growing hip factor of the box, released a sort of updated version of it in 1996, named the MC303 Groove Box. This machine, slightly larger than the original 303 and packed with all sorts of capabilities particularly suited for contemporary dance music, was a hit on the market, selling 50,000 units in less than 2 years. The Groove Box was quite popular among producers who had never had access to an original TB-303 and who didn't mind Roland's decision to use TB303 samples instead of its actual original circuitry as the sound engine for the MC303. Purists scoffed at the new machine, preferring the retro analog superiority of the 1984 version 303. Indeed, the sort of cult appeal of the 303 grew steadily from the late 1980s onwards, to the extent that the discontinued machine's value eventually increased beyond the point of affordability for many of the bedroom studio musicians who helped to mythologize it in the first place. The 303's fetishization reached great proportions through 1997 and into 1998, during a time when the UK's Prodigy, whose abrasive and distorted 303-laden album The Fat of the Land, on Madonna's recording label Maverick, reached #1 both in the US and the UK pop charts upon release.
Smack my bitch up.
Not even Madonna herself was immune to the effects of the vogue TB303 sound. Here the machine can be heard playing a simple 16th note repeating phrase in her track Ray of Light, released in 1998. Also released in the years 1997 and 98, in addition to a growing number of 303 tracks, was computer software, which sought to emulate the Roland machine at a more affordable price. The product Rebirth, released by Sweden's Propellerhead Software, used algorithms modeled after the physical circuitry of the 303 in order to mimic its distinct sound. The software was priced at around $200, far cheaper than a used TB303, which, depending on its condition, could sell in upwards of $1,000. It is interesting to note that in addition to recreating the sound of the 303 digitally, the engineers who programmed Rebirth also sought to emulate the control surface of the machine, on screen. These virtual knobs and buttons were initially controlled via the computer mouse or trackpad. Some would contend that this made for somewhat cumbersome interaction with the software on the part of the user, with the result that music component manufacturers developed all-purpose fader boxes with physical buttons and knobs to control programs like Rebirth. So today, we have computer software consisting of representations of a three-dimensional interface on a two-dimensional screen being controlled by third-party hardware so as to emulate the sound of a machine built 20 years ago, which was itself built to emulate the sound of a machine built 30 years before it. That the rich history of the 303 and the ways it spawned further cultural and technological experimentation would have occurred at all had Roland's so-called arrogant designers succeeded in producing a viable bassline instrument circa 1984 remains to be seen. Finally, perusing Roland's promotional literature, in particular the section about the history of their instruments, the following passage is found. Quote, 1980-1981, TR-808 Programmable Rhythm Machine, TB303 Bassline. A groundbreaking rhythm machine that used microcomputer chips which allowed the user to program a song's rhythm patterns. Along with the TB303, the TR-808 still maintains considerable popularity among musicians and studios. Unquote.